Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention. Thank you. My apologies to the people who are on the sides. We unfortunately don't have enough chairs here. Distinguished guests, members of the Consular Corps, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This evening's event is truly special. It follows President and Michelle Obama's historic visit to Cuba in March, just 3 weeks ago. Now, allow me to confide in you, while it took papal intercession to get our two presidents together, our getting the Cuban ambassador to come here so soon after all his strenuous work in helping to arrange the presidential visit to Cuba was discreetly arranged by our two wives. And those of you who have been married as long as we have, you know where the power is. The resumption of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba and the meetings between Presidents Obama and Raul Castro have turned the page on one of the most important and contentious relations between two countries. While issues and differences remain, this diplomatic opening provides the opportunity for our two governments and people to engage with one another directly. As a White House spokesman said, quote, "We want to open up more opportunities for U.S. businesses and travelers to engage with Cuba, and we want the Cuban government to open up more opportunities to its people, for its people, to benefit from that very engagement." Strategic dialogue between adversaries is a key component of diplomacy and a way to determine common ground to help resolve differences. We did this during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and with the Cold War over, the time is well past for the United States and Cuba to move forward. The Rice University community is looking forward to building on this important relationship in the years ahead. In fact, Rice's baseball team will travel to Cuba this fall and play 5 games against Cuban teams. And spend 5 days completing coursework related to Cuba and Latin America. Our athletics department prides itself not only on its athletics dexterity, but also its intellectual dexterity. Our guest speaker this evening is a man who has played and will continue to play an important role in this historic opening. His Excellency José Cabañas, a longtime member of Cuba's Foreign Service, assumed his position as ambassador to the United States without having to move his office in Washington. He just informed us that it is the oldest embassy in Washington, about 99 years in there. It's a beautiful building if you haven't seen it. He had been the chief of the Cuban interest section in Washington since 2012 and presented his credentials as Cuba's first ambassador to the United States in more than 50 years to President Barack Obama on September 17, 2015. His appointment to the post came 2 months after the restoration of diplomatic relations between our two countries, which were broken off, as you know, in 1961 during the very height of Cold War hostilities. Ambassador Cabañas is from Matanzas, a city on Cuba's northern coast. He earned a bachelor's degree in international political science in 1983 from the Raul Roa Garcia Higher Institute for International Relations in Havana. He would return there years later to serve as a senior professor. He joined Cuba's foreign ministry in 1984 and began focusing primarily on North America. In 1986 and in 1990 was assigned to the Cuban embassy in Canada. He returned to Havana in 1993 as deputy director of the ministry's North American Affairs Division. Ambassador Cabañas is a distinguished diplomatic career. His distinguished diplomatic career involves various high-level assignments also in Europe. In 2005, the ambassador was brought back to Havana to serve in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was named the Vice Minister of Foreign Relations in 2009, a post he held until taking over Cuba's interest section in Washington. During the year that he won his ministerial appointment, he remarkably also earned a PhD in political science from the University of Havana. So please join me in welcoming His Excellency José Ramón Cabañas to the podium.
Well, good evening. Ambassador, thank you for your kind words. We would like first to thank the Rice University for this invitation, the Baker Institute as well. It's an honor and an opportunity for us to be here, to share some knowledge with you, to listen from you as well, and try to address your questions and your concerns. We are bringing a presentation. Hopefully, I will not mislead you using this remote thing, but actually, in a way, to provoke a little bit your questions that we will address later. I think the subject here is the future of the bilateral relations, but if you allow me a little bit, and let's see if this works. It seems that it doesn't. It does. Well, there you have like a resume of what happened since December 17th. Don't worry, I don't want you to know in detail, or try to read everything, but 50% of us, we consider that we are going too fast, and the other 50 is that we are going too slow. What I can tell you is that we have covered a lot of issues in the last year and a half. I was misquoted once when I made a presentation about these topics in Sarasota. A newspaper said that we said that it was the first time that we, Cuba and the United States, we had the opportunity to negotiate and to talk with respect, with reciprocity in a variety of issues. Actually, what I tried to say at that time, I was misquoted, is that it is the first time we have the opportunity to address a variety of issues, but at the same time to try to focus, and this is a kind of conversation we never had before, to try to figure out which would be the foundation of our bilateral ties. This is not a conversation that we had before 1959. It didn't happen during the time of Spain in Cuba. Then as countries, as governments, we never had such an opportunity, and then we are trying to do that this time. During the last year, after the announcement in December 17th, we initiated in January a comprehensive process of negotiations, first to reestablish bilateral ties and to reopen embassies, then to mark a moment when we were able to do that, and finally to recognize each other as equals. Sorry, I have to add that Bernardo Toscano from my staff is here also. Then if I'm wrong, he will correct me immediately. Bernardo has been in foreign service also for a while, very knowledgeable about Cuban foreign policy, and he's his fourth term in the United States. He did probably something wrong. He has come too many times, 3 times in Washington and 1 in New York. And as we said, we try first to address that, and then to initiate a period, we don't know how long it will take, when we should be able to normalize our bilateral ties. What's the meaning of that? Well, to address those issues, at least that we know they are essential to have a normal relationship. And now the second question is, what is normal? And the answer is, we don't know. Simply, we don't have, in other scenarios, you have like a Bible or a reference book, and you can go there and check paragraph, that page. No, in this case, we don't have a reference book. We actually have to discover every day. But at least we have this process mainly from January last year to July, when we finally reestablished bilateral ties, in which we have found a way to understand each other, to know what is important for each other, and basically to show respect for the other. You can imagine we have two teams of negotiators that they have to have trust on what they were sharing, trust on what they were saying, and finally to get an agreement. If you have attended classes in conflict resolution, you will imagine how difficult it is. It's difficult to understand that at the classroom, but it's more difficult to apply that in a real negotiating room. As you remember, President Obama and President Raúl Castro met in Panama. That was an important moment to address at the highest level bilateral issues. That happened in April. Cuba was finally removed from that list we never belonged to, the terrorists, countries that sponsor terrorism. And that created a new scenario, and it was, I would say, a goodwill signal to us that the negotiations were moving forward in a proper way. Since then, we have welcomed 4 members of the American cabinet. Secretary Vilsack, he has gone twice to Cuba. Secretary Pritzker for Commerce, twice as well, Secretary Kerry. And Administrator Maria Contreras for Small Business Administration, she visited Cuba as part of the President Obama delegation. That is to explain it very, very fast what has happened during the last year and the year and a half. Probably we should do this first, and then we will return to the other one. This is to summarize a little bit the many subjects we are talking in different groups right now. It's like you have 13 there, but there are actually 18 different issues we are addressing now. From oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, which is of your concern in this city and in this state, of course, to financial claims. We have claims at both ends. To human rights, we have addressed that. How to expand exchange of sciences in universities as well, telecommunication, law enforcement. By the way, law enforcement is by itself a major issue. We have our expert talking to your officials in law enforcement, from Homeland Security to Justice Department. It's a very broad set of subjects that we are covering, and hopefully we will be able to sign soon a comprehensive memorandum on those issues. Addressing from terrorism to illegal migration, migratory fraud, many others. At some point, I would say in September last year, we realized that we had too many issues. We were addressing too many issues at the same time. And we created a bilateral, well, here it's called Bilateral Steering Committee. We call it Bilateral Commission, which is the 2 delegations, and probably the best faces that you note related to that. They are Assistant Secretary Roberta Jacobson and Director General Josefina Vidal. 2 ladies had the opportunity to address the bilateral issues. And we have that commission in order to establish like a roadmap of our priorities. What we have the sense that we can accomplish first. What do we need to have an impact on a specific area? And we have met twice. The first meeting September 11, the second in November, and very soon we have the 3rd round of the bilateral commission, which again we like review what has been happening during the last month, and we establish some parameters and some priorities on what can be discussed. Then, as a result of those different negotiations and debates, we have been able so far to sign those 7 memorandums or joint statement or declaration. Some of them you will probably consider that they are not that important, like postal service. If you think about sending letters, but postal service is not like that anymore. And it has the potential to expand and increase dramatically in the near future. You have the memorandum on civil aviation that will provide the opportunity to, hopefully very soon, by the end of this year, to have regular flights and direct flights from the States to Cuba, back and forth. That will change dramatically the life of many people, not only Americans who are able to travel to Cuba under the 12 legal categories, but the Cuban Americans who live in these countries, and they will do it with a better service from many cities. Secretary Vilsack from Agriculture, he has been working day and night and our crew also in Cuba, to have this memorandum on agriculture was signed recently, as you can see. And again, that encompasses many issues. Those are the documents we have signed. We started recently the official talks on health and public health. And that's an area, when I'm asked about the potential and the bilateral relation, I say most of the time that if we have to agree on something, that would be public health. If we have an area where what we can accomplish jointly, what we can accomplish is endless, it will be health. With your knowledge, your resources are mainly knowledge, not that many resources, but again, we can address many issues. One of the latest is Zika, for example. You updated your figures today. In tropical diseases, we have got some knowledge about how to be successful addressing those issues, and that's definitely a knowledge that we will and we will share with your authorities. And hopefully soon, I mean, if I can return to Houston in 10 months, probably that list would be longer, and we will have on that list, for example, what we are able to agree on public health. Environment, and we have also the marine protected areas. Most people don't know that most of the fisheries you have in Florida, what you catch here is born in Cuba. I mean, the trend is that those species develop there. And if we have a negative impact in fisheries in Cuba, you will receive the impact immediately here in Florida, to say the least. We have to say that it has been, I mean, we as diplomats, we have done, I think, our job in some way, but it's amazing what our scientists have done over the years without any official support, in many cases without funding. And that's one of the areas, to put an example, the Moat Aquarium in Florida with the Cuban National Aquarium, what they are doing and what they have been doing with the coral reef, with the sharks and many species, again, it's amazing what they have accomplished, and now we can do more with the official support at both ends. Well, the meaning of normalization. Usually, when some media cover our statements about normalization, is something like, well, now we have bilateral ties, but you know, Cubans, they always complain about something, and now they are saying that, well, it's fine to have bilateral ties, but in order to normalize links, well, those are the issues we have said that we should continue, at least from our end, we should continue addressing in order to have normal ties. And we think it's simple to understand that unless the sanctions regime is lifted, we cannot have normal ties. I mean, if we would like to put more flesh on the bones of the bilateral ties, we have to have trade. we have to have economic exchange. And currently, I wouldn't say it is impossible, but it's very, very difficult to have, we don't have trade, technically speaking. We don't have investment, and we don't have major exchange between our two economies. Guantanamo Base, well, this is simple part of our territory. And any state will say, well, unless you perform your sovereignty in the whole of your territory, you have still something to claim. If you would like, during the question and answer period, we can address this issue, which we understand in the United States is quite related to terrorism, to the prison that is there. But it's, this subject has a very long history, back since 1898. What they are called now democracy funds. In former times, they were called regime change funds. Well, they are still approved in Congress, and there is a large amount of money that is addressed to pay to some people and some organizations to perform in Cuba in a specific way. I'm trying to be very diplomatic here. But it's something that simply we don't have in Cuba. I mean, we don't have any fund in Cuba being passed in order to be used in the United States to accomplish something, just to speak in very general terms. And it's not related to bilateral ties with Cuba. I mean, we don't think that if you have normal ties with a sovereign country, you should have specific programs in order to change something specifically in the other country. And radio and TV, Martí, well, to speak quite frankly, this is mainly a political statement. I mean, for us, it makes a lot of irritation for our people to have the name of our national hero being used in that initiative. And the whole criteria back in the 80s that supported that project to create that service was the lack of independent information in the Cuban society. And those projects were created to fill, that vacuum, to provide Cuban people with independent information. I will not go further on that. What we simply say is there is no need to have that kind of specific service addressed to Cuba, as we have shared for many, many years, information from the real American sources, from radio stations to TV stations, as we are too close. And in many cases, and in this global world in which we are living, with internet and other services, I mean, this is simply to irritate us and our population and our authorities. Again, this is something that we have on our list to normalize bilateral ties. We think normalization, we will arrive there when we have removed these obstacles. We are not saying that we will reverse the process, and we have faced the challenge to reestablish bilateral ties and reopen embassies, although we still think that we have to address these issues. Well, these two pieces now is trying to summarize a little bit this one and mainly this one, what the areas where we have seen most of the new regulations taking place. The sanctions are still in place, but the White House and the American government, of course, has tried to support the decisions, political decisions taken with some actions that actually facilitate the exchange. And then some regulations and some amendments has been introduced, although the sanctions regime is there, but at least we have seen changes that make possible, well, to sign those memorandums I mentioned, to be, for example, to make possible to have more flexibility in travel. Still the 12 categories are there, but you see less enforcement. The last, you have had 4 different moments in which those new regulations were introduced. When we had the first package, and this is an anecdote, but it's the way it happened, January last year, immediately after the announcement in December, the administration was, the officials were commenting that they were producing the first package. Our suggestion was, don't do it fast, take your time, try to write something that is enforceable, try to talk to each other as you are covering many areas. Well, what happened was exactly the opposite. They did it fast, they didn't talk to each other, and this is something I'm sharing with you because we have shared these thoughts with them, and they recognize it, that they happened that way. And by the end, you had a set of regulations that produce nothing. The first limit is that people who were writing the regulations, they know a little bit about Cuba. You had people writing regulations on banking services that never talked to our officials in the field. And at that time, if that would have happened years ago, we have said, well, this is done. We finished the conversation here. But our approach was, let's have a dialogue among regulators. And you would imagine how interesting is, to say the least, a conversation between OFAC, and you know the role of OFAC. It's the organization enforcing the sanctions against Cuba, talking with those people who are under sanctions in Cuba. OFAC talking, for example, with the central bank, trying to understand how our system works in order to produce a regulation that actually helps you to accomplish something in regards to Cuba. And we have had 3 different talks, or mainly 2 actually. In February last year, we have a brief conversation with our lawyers in the United States talking to the regulators. And then when Secretary Pritzker visited Cuba September last year, we had the first comprehensive round of talks among regulators from the States and regulators from Cuba. And in February, when our Minister for Foreign Trade and Investment, Rodrigo Ramírez, visited Washington, then we have the third round. It's mainly how to understand how the system works here and there, and how you produce a set of regulations that actually can help in what the current policy would like to accomplish. Trying to respond to the question about how many things we have accomplished, and the complaint from the media, well, you're not producing something, Cubans are too slow, Cubans, they don't want to have real relationship with the United States. Well, at least that's a small presentation of the kind of commercial agreements we have been able to pass, to introduce. Well, you have already Starwood hotels, and they will be managing 3 different hotels in Cuba. We are not talking about investments. You have the major phone carriers in the United States at least signing an initial agreement with Texas, which is our national carrier. You have General Electric signing a memorandum with 3 different areas in which they think they can have some exchange with Cuba. And you have the cruise business starting activities in May. In that area, we have had some complaints, several complaints from several people, again, saying the Cubans are too slow, they are not approving the American proposals. But to give you a sense of the very limits we still face, well, I have to tell you, only last month, the US authorities were able to take Cuba out of the list of those countries that their ports are not safe. Until very recently, even after the regulation about the cruisers and the ferries. Actually, the regulation talks about commercial vessels in general terms. Only after that regulation was passed or was introduced, then we were removed. We had first the visit of your authorities to inspect the port, and then they decided to take Cuba out of that list. I have to tell you, we have been in many lists during our lifetime, but now the good news, we belong to a small amount of lists. This is probably the best argument, you know. I love maps, and that map explains you many things. We have mentioned several times during our negotiations and our debates that we are neighbors, of course, and as neighbors we have to share many concerns and address many issues. I will return to this, but I love this better than the other one. Here you have not all, but most of the ports that are quite interested in doing business with Cuba. During the last 2 years, we have developed a project called Mariel Economic Zone. We have now a deep water container terminal in Mariel. We have dismantled Havana as a harbor dedicated to trade and commerce. And we have moved everything 40 miles from Havana. And in Mariel, we have a port with very good conditions to expand trade, not only for Cuba, but for the region. Of course, you will realize that that project is connected to what is happening in Panama these days. Very soon, you will have in the Caribbean post-Panamax ships coming around. And for many ports, mainly in the south of the United States, transshipping is a new word, is a new interest. And at least we have signed a memorandum already with Norfolk, Virginia, which is not probably the most prominent port in the United States for Cuba, but it's connected to the kind of political activism, I would say, that the local government in Virginia has developed. I mean, the governor visited, a large delegation from Virginia is present in Havana Fair every year in Cuba, but still many other ports, including Houston, by the way, they are interested and they would like to develop a kind of cooperation, at least with Mariel. Of course, we have other ports in Cuba, but Mariel is the most promising port. Going back to that map explains you, first, both we share the Gulf of Mexico. There is a lot of activity, offshore drilling from the United States, from Mexico, from Cuba, and well before the announcements in December 17, 2014, we were able to create a multilateral body, our three countries with Bahamas and Jamaica, in order to address our concerns about avoiding oil spills in the Caribbean. You can imagine if all of us, we decide to drill offshore without some control, what could happen in the Caribbean. Many accidents. We have to talk about regulations. We have to talk about real capability to address and to face an accident. Regrettably, you had already the experience of the Macondo drilling. You have the BP Commission report. We have done a very good use of it in Cuba and its recommendation. But we can move from Gulf of Mexico offshore drilling to tropical diseases. Many diseases you have in Florida, at least, or Louisiana and other states to the south, we share them. Not only the problem, but also the solution in Cuba. If we talk about climate change, what the effect of climate change in Cuba is pretty similar to what you have at least in Louisiana and Florida. Again, the same effect of the sea level in our sea line. You will have the same effect in those states. we share, since Sandy, I think people understand better in the United States how we share the impact of hurricanes and tropical storms. And we have the capacity not only to take profit of that for our own countries, but we think we could play the role regionally for other countries that they don't have the infrastructure or the educated officials in order to prevent the impact of such events. And that map could help us also to imagine the many issues we should address in the future. If we talk about narcotics, we are right in the middle. We have in our national shield, we have a key, and some people ask, why do you have a key? Well, Cuba has been known as being the key of the Caribbean for many years, because we are right in the middle, and we are right in the middle for good and for bad. Most of the time we are in the middle fighting illegal activities in the Caribbean. We have been doing that on our own, but we do believe that it would be better if we can do it jointly. You know, it will be more effective, and we will take care of the resources in a proper manner. That would summarize a little bit what has been happening at the bilateral level, the official level. It's impossible in a few minutes to mention you here what is going on at the state level. As I said, we have welcomed 4 different governors, but NGOs, religious organizations, universities. By the way, I think we can be talking about peace unless we have a problem with baseball, but hopefully not. We have to negotiate that, to lose a couple of games and then to win a couple of them. But in sports, that's another area in which is endless what we can do. You know, it's public that the Major League of Baseball is talking with our federation in order to regularize the exchange of members of our teams, and they can play in the States and to return to Cuba. The negotiations are still going. But if you ask, and probably I'm taking one of the questions right now, the most important result of the change in politics, at least considering the announcement in December 17th, 2014, from your side, I would say that in some ways the invitation that President Obama has delivered to everybody to have a say on this policy. I mean, in former times, the policy towards Cuba was decided by not a very large amount of people in Congress, in other agencies in government. Now, for the first time in many years, I think the American public, American institutions, people in government and outside government, they have a say in that policy, and they have been participating in increasing numbers on the definition of that policy. Just to give you a figure, because sometimes people vote with feet, not with the hands. The amount of travelers to Cuba, and again, we cannot talk here about tourism. We are talking about travel to Cuba. Last year increased 77%, American travelers to Cuba. And Cuban Americans, which of course they have a good reason to go, and the amount of Cuban Americans visiting Cuba was a large number for many years. But last year, they had a record of 298,000 Cuban Americans coming to Cuba. And I'm talking not about visits, I'm talking about persons. If you have visits more than that, because you have one person going probably 2 or 3 times a year. That's at the public level, the less unofficial level, the amount of, the impact that this new policy have had in the public. I think we should leave it here, and we are open to respond to your questions. Yeah, sure.
Look at all these questions.
Do you have breakfast?
So please don't be offended if your question is not asked. You're in Houston, a very entrepreneurial city, Mr. Ambassador, so I'm going to try to join some of these questions for whatever brief response you can give to them. Houston, the energy capital of the world, several questions on the energy sector. Do you expect the U.S. to allow U.S. oil companies to explore in Cuban waters? Will Cuba permit and offer oil and gas contracts for the development of offshore oil and gas resources? U.S. companies want to hire Cuban employees without having to hire them through the government. Is that something the Cuban government will permit? Those are three, if you want to answer in a generic sense, please.
Well, the oil and gas, I hope they will. In some way, it is not happening due to the limits that are still in place. Before being taken out of the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism, we were not allowed to import anything with more than 10% component of American raw materials or anything. Now, we are in a situation in which we can import something that has more than that, but up to 35% of American component. And it's difficult when most of the technology that deals with oil and gas has some American technology. The funny thing about the percentage is that people who decided on that ruling, they don't have a clue on how to calculate the 10% or the 35%. And this is as part of the conversation we have had. They have said, we don't know simply how to calculate that. But it's something that is in force. We have had 4 attempts to, drilling offshore in Cuba, and we have done that with Scarabeo 9, which is a Chinese technology platform. We had to bring from Asia. That platform was inspected in Trinidad and Tobago to certify that it didn't have more than 10% at the time of American components. This is to mention the limits that are still in place as part of the sanction regime. Now, the other reason is that most of your major companies are simply looking inward. I was explaining to the ambassador that you are too busy with your own production and your own market, but still in the South you have many companies that they can provide several kind of services to major companies that are drilling offshore in Cuba, and this is definitely an opportunity. You have many experts, most of them here in Texas, by the way, who have been supporting the idea, which is a very important idea of, although we have that multilateral agreement, I mentioned Mexico, United States, Bahamas, and Jamaica, and Cuba, which is important, and is how we will act against or to face oil spill. You have to have companies also doing for that. We have had some rehearsals, we have had some drills, we know, we have each other phone lines, we know to whom we have to call, but if we do have an impact, we have to move forward. And the technology is in many cases in the hands of the private sector. We don't have that network of companies that will act together. That could happen to us, that could happen to you again, that could happen to Mexico, that could happen to others. And we can link oil spill to environment, to coral reef, to fisheries. I mean, that will have a massive impact. That's in general terms, we expect, and hopefully, we don't have, by the way, in Cuba, any ruling that prevents any American company on any fields to do business with Cuba. We never had any sanctions regime on you guys. It's important for you to know. Then that's part of the answer when some people say, well, the United States has introduced a lot of new regulations, but Cuba is doing nothing. Well, we don't have to do anything, because we don't have to remove you from any list. We don't have a sanctions regime on you. We don't have a military base on you guys. And like that, in many other sectors, we don't have any piece of legislation in Cuba saying we welcome businessmen or scholars from any part of the world except the United States. We don't have that. We don't say by any means we welcome tourists or visitors from all over the world except the United States. Then we don't have to make that many regulations, because even in the last legislation about foreign trade, we don't make any difference with the United States, with Switzerland, with Germany. It's the whole world. The question about hiring directly and not going through state agencies. First, probably we have to explain better why we have had that system for many years. And probably no. We have several exceptions from the rule. But this is, we have actually two major agencies that take care of that. First, their role is to certify. I mean, if you have a company that is looking for engineers, you will go there and you will hire real engineers on that particular field, and we take care of all the documentation, all of that. Another element, if the company finally fires that worker, well, we take care of them. I mean, the company doesn't have to pay for anything, or not for the salary anymore, not for the social services that worker we have to provide them. We take him back, and the company decides to fire that people, and we take care of them to be employed somewhere else. Now, for some people, I have to tell you, it's a problem. I can share with you what some other foreign investors have commented in Cuba. They prefer to do it that way, because when they ask for, let's say, a physician, they know it will be among the best, is certified, and they know that when they decide to fire or probably to leave Cuba, then someone else will take care of that. In other countries, you don't have that rules. You fire people, and you have a very important social problem you have to deal with. This is not our case. But again, those regulations are there and were decided at the time when we don't have massive foreign investment. The scenario will change, and probably that's the kind of decisions and rules we have to accommodate in the future.
Well, of course, your government's going through a process of economic reforms now, which is what you're talking about there. A related question is, please comment on the ability of private Cuban citizens to make contracts, especially employment contracts, with U.S. private companies and private companies. I mean, that's part of you. I think you partially.
Yeah, it's what is doable now from the States. And we can pick specific examples. Would you have an American worker under contract in Cuba? I don't think you can do that. If you, in order to promote and to expand private sector, by the way, we always had private sector in Cuba. The new thing is here that we have expanded that private sector. The whole industry about cigars in Cuba is based on private business. You never had state-owned farms to cultivate the tobacco leaf, and to produce rum. A large percentage of private land produce sugar cane in order to produce rum. And then we always had that figure in Cuba. Now it's more expanded, but it depends on the many issues. I mean, the many limits you have for bilateral relations between Cuba and United States. Some people say, well, now craftsmen, they are private or they are cooperative. Well, they need more raw material to produce. And as part of this policy and the many changes we have had since December 2014, the official policy from the United States is to help the private sector to have all the potential in that sector. Well, how you can provide them with the raw materials or the resources or the funds you cannot do that because still that's part of the sanctions regime that is in place.
Question about the Cuban exile community. Given that older members of Cuba's exile community may be hesitant or untrusting of the Cuban government, is Cuba attempting to reach out to this older group? And related, what is the view of the Cuban government regarding assets appropriated from U.S. citizens?
Well, the Cuban Americans, I wouldn't divide, groupings about the elders. I'm becoming old guy. I would say that the opportunity, the personal opportunity to have been involved in this for many years. I was head of the consular service in Cuba. And in the 90s, it was very familiar for me to visit Miami and to have an exchange with people in many places, not only in the United States. And I think we have introduced major changes in our policy, mainly in our migratory policy. The last group of rules were introduced in 2013. And our aim is to normalize that link with everybody. Of course, we understand that every family has a past and have an explanation for not living in Cuba, for migrating to going somewhere. Let me tell you, many people now is the new normal is Cuban Americans with residence in the United States and in Cuba at the same time. Your legislation provides that, our legislation provides that, and then they are living in the best of the two worlds. They are here for a while, they go to Cuba, they go back, they go to, many people are doing that. Then our policy is not addressed to any specific group, is to everybody. Probably that group that was mentioned on the question is more easy, I would say, because they have a remembrance of the presence in Cuba or the family ties. Sometimes it's more difficult to do this with the younger generation, that they consider themselves, from the cultural point of view, Cuban Americans, but they were born in the United States. In many cases, they don't speak Spanish at all. But it's funny because the first time they go to Cuba, they kind of reconnect. I don't know, that's probably a subject for a thesis on social studies. How it happened and why it happened, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that the reconnection is pretty soon. We have very interesting figures. For example, like 2 years ago, we had 75,000 so-called Cuban Americans, young Cuban Americans, born in the United States, who were in Cuba without their parents. A spring break, at some moment they sent them in Cuba and they were living with a relative for a week, for 2 weeks. And again, I'm not talking about children that they were basically born in the United States. But it's a cultural process, it takes a while. My personal view is that all of that is moving to normalization, to a normal, in which a family or a member of a family who live in the United States, like the ones who live in Germany or Japan, by the way, we have Cubans in Japan, they go to Cuba and they visit and they stay with the relative in the same way other people do. But again, we are not addressing any specific groups among Cuban Americans. And the other one related to, sorry?
Expropriation of
well, as I said, we have a negotiation on claims. You did have a commission that certified 5,711 claims, I think, back in the 60s. We have our own claims because the blockade or embargo against Cuba has had a major effect in our economy, and we update every year the financial cost of those sanctions. And we sat and we explained each other how we calculated those figures. We will move from there. Now, I can tell you something. The only country that never compensated those properties that were nationalized was United States. We did the process with Spain, with France, with Canada, with all the countries that had property in Cuba during the period of the nationalization. And the facts are, we can have the interpretation of the fact, but the facts are that our law for nationalization provided that we could compensate American property through the income we got under the sugarcane quota in the United States. Immediately after that law was approved, the sugar quota was canceled for Cuba. We never had the resources to compensate the American property in Cuba. Again, you can ask to anyone who had a property from Canada, from Spain, from Italy, from France. We were able to compensate after the process, but it's still a pending issue with the United States.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. The ambassador has another commitment. But I've got to ask you this question. I don't expect you to answer it, but I think it has to come from Bernie Sanders, one of our presidential candidates. And it's, how can the U.S. help assure that the benefits of an apertura go to the people of Cuba and not to the wealthy capitalists or an elite Cuban oligarchy? Thank you very much, Ambassador.